"Molly, is that you?" Nancy exclaimed in surprise as she ran into her neighbor in the entryway. It had been several years since Molly had been declared dead. Nancy was therefore not so much surprised as amazed. She didn't understand how such a thing was possible. At first, the woman even thought she was dreaming. But stopping on the stairs and looking carefully into the face of the woman passing by Nancy, became convinced that it was she who was in front of her. Molly, on the other hand, did not know what to say. She realized that so much had probably happened in the time she had been away from the apartment building she lived in. Nancy was a well-known local gossip and always knew everything and about everyone. But Molly had always been treated with warmth, and the woman herself loved her neighbor very much. By nature, Nancy was a woman kind and sympathetic. She was always ready to help and support. But at that moment, she did not know what to say to Molly and how to talk to her too. With all her appearance, the woman made it clear that she was rushing home to her beloved husband, who had to believe to the very end that his wife was alive and well, that she would be found, she would return home, and they would live happily again. But James turned out to be completely different from the man Molly knew and loved. As it turned out, for many years he only pretended to be a caring family man. But in fact, as they say, in a quiet pool there are devils. This well-known phrase describes James's character perfectly. Married to Molly. He did marry Molly out of great love. They were young then, inexperienced, their whole lives ahead of them. Fall in love, get married, and if things went wrong, they could always split up. At least Molly didn't put any deep meaning into her marriage. She got married just to be married and see what it was like. She liked James, and he seemed a decent young man to her mother. In general, a new cell of society was formed literally out of nothing. The young people did not live badly. They quarreled rarely and spent time together. Quite often they studied, worked part-time to have something to pay for small expenses. They had fun, just like everyone else. But it only lasted until Molly's mom got seriously ill. The woman faded away literally before her eyes, along with the fact that Molly had to take care of her. She had to take care of a young daughter who was born a few years before the illness. Then James realized that marriage is hard work. And in family life, there are not only joyful, easy, but also difficult moments that spouses must experience together. It cannot be said that in that difficult period, James did not help Molly. On the contrary, he threw all his strength to at least somehow alleviate the sad share of his wife. Even quit his job, so that he would not have to torn between running for food and medicine for an elderly and seriously ill woman, taking care of his daughter and earning money. Fortunately, by then the family was firmly on its feet. Molly always earned an order of magnitude more than her husband, which was not surprising at all. Unlike James, she still received a higher education and made any career. He already, after failing exams and expulsion, and did not begin to recover in the institute. Why should he? The then still very young and reckless man brushed it off. When Molly asked if he would try to return to the institute, "I'd rather go to work." Expelled, so expelled. And God be with them. Maybe it's even for the best. I'll start earning quicker. I'll get on my feet and be able to achieve something in this life. And that's school. What does it do? Who needs a diploma anyway? Pride and resentment towards the teachers, who quite rightly and justly appreciated the young man's diligence in his studies, did not allow him to pull himself together and at least try to recover. Molly didn't insist. After all, maybe he's right, she thought to herself. Who knows what's best? The young man kept his word, immediately got a job, except that with only one certificate and an incomplete diploma, it was problematic to find a bread place. Therefore, James had to plow wherever he had to, which he quickly got bored. But he did not complain. He chose such a fate for himself. So why complain about it now? But when a few years after his wife graduated from college and got a job, her mom got sick. James took the sudden opportunity to forget about the hard, thankless labor. Molly looked at it through her sleeves at the time. She didn't care about it at all. The woman loved her mom very much and was attached to her. Hey! Her passing from life became for Molly the most real tragedy. And all attention was entirely focused on the funeral. And after saying goodbye to her mommy, the woman was very deeply immersed in her own thoughts and experiences. And again, Molly was not to her husband, who continued to sit at home at her neck. They lived on savings. And they, as you know, have the property to quickly run out. Of course, in a few years, Molly managed to accumulate a fairly decent amount of money. But it was not so big that she could live idly and not deny herself anything. Gradually, it was time to change the way of life for which James was not ready. The man realized that he was so tired of everything that had been happening in his and Molly's life lately that he had no energy for anything at all. Molly decided not to put pressure on her husband. After all, he is now her only close person, except for her daughter. The woman sincerely believed that another month or two, and everything will improve. After all, it was her mother who died. And by and large, it was Molly, not James, who should have been depressed. But in their family, everything turned out exactly the opposite. As time passed, nothing changed. When Molly raised the question about the shop, James began to justify that he was looking for a suitable place. But so far, he hadn't been able to find something that suited him. Molly had neither the energy nor the desire to argue with her husband, so she continued to bravely pull the strain alone. Sometime after the family was more or less settled, Molly formalized the inheritance and gave her daughter to school. The woman decided to go to the village, to her old grandmother. This news stunned James very much. No, of course, he had heard about Cindy before, who never recognized the hustle and bustle of the city. So she lived on the outskirts. But this was the first time James had ever heard of Molly wanting to visit her. Cindy had been so withdrawn and reclusive that she hadn't even come to the funeral of Molly's mother's own daughter. James didn't understand how she could even be socialized with after that. It did not fit in the man's head. But apparently Molly thought completely differently, and he did not want to interfere in it. So after listening to the admonitions and lectures before his wife left, he didn't even ask when she would be back. "Don't forget, please, that Lisa must be picked up from school every day," Molly said sternly. "Not to linger anywhere or go missing, so she doesn't have to walk alone. School is close to home, of course, but she's still too young. Do you understand me, huh?" James complied, nodding. Hey. Molly had high hopes for his discretion. Lately, she'd noticed that her husband had been missing from time to time. Mostly it happened in the evening, and of course, the woman could not help but ask her husband where he constantly goes, and even without her, and without warning. Naturally, James found an excuse. You bet, because the man had a faithful and loyal friend, Mom. And he could always and in everything could rely on her. Molly knew her mother-in-law only superficially. They had never been in love with each other, but there was no animosity between them. They rarely spoke to each other, only on holidays. And when her son decided to marry Molly, his mother told him one thing. "Do you want to live with her? They're mine." Thus, the woman made it clear to James that she, of course, is not delighted with his choice, but also to prevent their wedding is not going to. The woman took this stance when she learned that her son was not going to bring his wife into their home. "We will stay at Molly's," the young man replied, when his mother openly asked him where they were going to move to after the wedding. That put the woman at ease. The question was put to rest. If the daughter-in-law is not looming in front of your eyes every day, it makes absolutely no difference how she treats her. Molly had always shown her mother-in-law respect, but she wasn't too eager to socialize with her either. And so they lived, and quite well, until the family began to have trouble, from which James very much wanted to get away and abstract. But Molly was worried not so much for her husband As for her daughter, Except for her father, there was no one else to leave the girl with. Of course, Miranda could help, but Molly didn't want to ask her mother-in-law for anything personally. It would be one thing if James himself talked to her about it, and it would be quite another if it fell to Molly. Fortunately, her husband literally read her mind. Of course, he had brought it up solely for his own sake, and Molly understood that. Still, she would feel much better if her mother-in-law looked after Lisa. "Would you mind if I sent Lisa to my mom's for a week?" James asked unobtrusively. "You're only going to the country for a week. Can you take a week off from school?" "Let's do that. It's just that you know I'm the same kind of cook, but I don't know anything at all, and our daughter will be much safer in a woman's hands. At least she'll always be with E-Teeps." Molly didn't expect James to suggest it, and of course she agreed. It couldn't be said that Miranda was thrilled about her granddaughter's visit. But what wouldn't you do for your favorite son? "Son, please don't forget that I have a lot of things to do," the woman said. "I'm expecting you in exactly 1 week, and I hope there will be no unpleasant surprises." "Of course, ma'am," smiled James. "I promise you that everything will be fine. In exactly 1 week, Molly and I will be picking up your pen. You call me if you need anything. You never know." Molly left her daughter's allowance with Miranda and left. When his wife didn't return on time, James didn't immediately sound the alarm. After cleaning the apartment, which had been smoky all this time, as James wasted no time, the man took his daughter from her mother and only tried to call his wife. "But where are you?" discontentedly muttered he, when once again heard at the other end of the wire, "The subscriber is temporarily unavailable. What the hell is this?" "But couldn't you call and tell him that he was delayed?" "You and I had a deal." The man didn't know Cindy's phone number. In fact, neither did he know the name of the village where Molly had gone. She had traveled there by bus from a distant town, the name of which James kept forgetting. To find any information at all, the man had to go through all of his wife's notebooks. Anything at all anymore. Territories. He, frantically flipping through the pages, another notebook found in the dresser drawer. After almost 24 hours of searching, the man still managed to find the name of the village and Cindy's phone number. Only here, disappointment awaited him. So was Molly's phone. The woman's number was also unavailable. James was ready to call the police. But a few hours later, the subscriber appeared on the network, and the woman even called him back. "Who is it?" "Hey," James heard an elderly voice on the other end of their line. "Speaking? I can't hear very well." "Hello," shouted James as loud as he could. "I'm the husband of Molly, your granddaughter. She went to visit you a week and a half ago, but unfortunately, she never came home. Can you please tell me if you have her? I'm very worried about her. Her daughter's here too. When is she planning on coming home?" After listening to James, Cindy sighed sadly. She would have liked to know where Molly was now. Her granddaughter had never reached her, and no matter how many times she tried to call her, it was all in vain. "Yes," the woman said, confirming James's worst fears. She'd vanished into thin air.
And where to look for her now? It's not clear at all. James hoped that he could get some clear information from Cindy. But his attempt to find out about his wife failed. The man realized that he would have to look for Molly himself. But how and where? The police were clearly not the answer. So the very next day after talking to Cindy, James went there. Well, said the investigator, nodding his pencil on the table. "Missing, so you say. And the neighborhood is approximate. You know, great. Leave a statement and I will contact my colleagues from this city and forward them all the necessary information. As soon as we know anything, I'll let you know." And that's all James asked, confused and indignant at the same time. "Is that all you can tell me? What else do you want me to say?" surprised the investigator.
We will do everything in our power to find your wife. But you're an adult. You must realize that crimes are committed often enough, and in the countryside, anything could have happened to her. As soon as the picture of the disappearance and the circumstances surrounding it are clear, I'll tell you all about it. That will be all. There's nothing more I can do for you at this time.
Miranda cooled his son's ardor. The woman sincerely did not understand what he expected from the investigator. Did you think you'd hear something different? She was surprised when the man told her everything. They have, how many people like you can't be counted? So calm down. He'll say something. They'll find some leads.
There's so much technology and opportunity now, you don't have to worry. Well, if something happened to your Molly, you'll find out soon enough.
It was the first time in his life James had been left alone with a problem this serious, and he didn't know what to do. Lisa was crying and asking where her mom was, and the man didn't even know what to say to her.
How to calm his daughter down. To tell the truth, James did not know how to calm himself. And how to live further and on what? After all, Molly was the only one who brought money into the family. Of course, after the death of his mother.
But it's a pittance compared to how much money you need to earn a decent living. It is unlikely that James could find a job that paid as well. The man sincerely hoped that a wife would be found. He would really hate to be alone. After he told his mistress Kelly about his wife's disappearance, it was as if she'd grown cold to him. They used to text, call, see each other regularly. And when Molly left, James even dared to invite the woman to his home. But now, the sweetheart was increasingly busy, and James had nothing left but to cope with his difficult emotional state of mind on his own.
So you were cheating on your wife too? Miranda asked Riley when her son complained to her about his mistress's behavior. Yes, son. There are many things I didn't know about you. I didn't expect this from you. Just please explain to me why you did it. What's so sweet about it?
Better, Molly. James didn't know the answer to that question himself.
It was just that at a certain point his wife bored him. The man was tired of household chemicals and the problems that arose in the family more and more often. He wanted new impressions and sensations. And then came Kelly, whom he met by chance. She was nothing like Molly. Next to Kelly, James was easy and fun, and the man was attracted to her, which was not surprising. Sweet, she didn't demand anything from him in return. She just enjoyed spending time with James, and the man thought it would last forever. But as you know, all good things come to an end sooner or later. So, and at ease relationship with Kelly, she did not just pout her lips and communicated with him so coolly when Molly disappeared. It turns out that the woman expected James to take decisive steps and was confident that he would figure it out on his own. But when she realized it was pointless to expect anything from James, she decided to talk to him herself.
The man exclaimed when he heard her voice in the receiver. I thought you had left me and would never call me again. You are not far from the truth. Kelly sighed sadly. I'll give you one more chance. We need to get together right away and have a serious talk. James was ready to drive up anywhere. He just couldn't be alone at that moment. The wait for news from the police was unbearable, and it seemed like it was taking forever. Kelly made an appointment for the man to meet at a restaurant, which James clearly approved. But he took money from the family and paid for a sumptuous dinner for himself and his beloved. In the morning, James picked up Lisa from school, and after taking her to the schools, went to class. Well, right from the doorstep, I can see it all the investigator knows about my life. To school.
The investigator was indignant. So I called you, James said. But you didn't pick up for some reason. The station refused to connect me to you either. I want to know what happened to my wife. I have a right to know. See, We have a daughter. She asks about her mom every day, and I don't know what to say because I have no idea what happened. But so any news, were you able to find out anything about Molly? There was news, of course, but it wasn't exactly comforting. The investigator had nothing to cheer James up about. Molly was last seen in one of the neighborhoods in the city where she was supposed to take a bus to the village. And no further information about her could be found. These cases last for years. The investigator sighed. Who knows where she might have gone or traveled? She only took tickets for the train to the city there. You realize the town is small. The area is mostly rural. I don't know what to tell you. Hang in there. James was in shock. He never imagined something like this would ever happen to him. The man was going to have a serious conversation with his daughter, who had decided to take Miranda on. Well, think about it, she reasoned. What are you, will you say? She is still very young, vulnerable. Let me talk to her, try to explain it to her somehow. I'll tell her that Mom went on a business trip to earn money for her and her future. She'll understand. And if you tell her the truth, it'll leave a permanent mark on her for the rest of her life. What if Molly comes back? I mean, she couldn't just fall through the cracks. Something really big had to happen for her to just disappear like that. That can't be true. Mom, do you believe it? James asked. Do you really think Molly disappeared of her own free will? The investigator made it clear that she was probably the victim of some serious crime. He's obviously not telling us something, but that doesn't make us feel any better. Miranda's mind was racing with other thoughts. She thought that Molly might well have a lover to whom she'd rushed off so quickly. And why wouldn't she? If James was having an affair on the side, Molly might well have done the same. It could be an old love, a longtime admirer she dated in her youth. And now he's suddenly asked her to meet him? To the woman herself, these thoughts didn't seem completely delusional. James was sure that something really serious had happened to his wife. The man did not allow even the thought that Molly could have someone else. When her mother finally shared her assumptions with him, he laughed in her face. What are you talking about? James smirked. I'd rather have a meteorite fall to Earth. Or I'd be a hermit. Why would Molly cheat on me? But you cheated on her? Miranda objected. What makes you think she couldn't have done the same thing? All right, let's say, James agreed. But what's that got to do with going to the country? That she couldn't find a lover in town? Mom, will you listen to yourself? What you're saying isn't even nonsense. It's completely absurd. But why would my mom, a successful, quite well-established in life, woman to go to hell in the middle of nowhere in order to cheat on me? That's the kind of ridiculous nonsense I didn't expect to hear from you. No, something's wrong with her. I can feel it. And James was right. A week later, he was contacted by an investigator who said that information had come in from out of town. You need to come down for a lineup, he said. And the moment James heard those words, his heart sank into his heels. What identification? He exclaimed. Did you find her? Yes. The man thought the investigator was inviting him to identify the body, but it wasn't really that bad. The only things James had to identify were a purse, in which his wife's passport was found, jeans, a t-shirt, and a jacket. All of this was found by local investigators near the river, right on the bank. James had to confirm or deny whether these things belonged to his wife or not. Although it would seem, what is there to disprove? The passport was found, so it's obvious. But it was a formality, and it had to be observed. It can't be helped. James recognized these things immediately. There was no doubt they belonged to Molly. What the hell is this? He asked the investigator when the procedure had come to an end. Did she drown, or are there any other theories? We didn't find a body, the investigator replied. But that doesn't mean anything, huh? It could have been carried away by the current. We've been searching all over the city. There are a number of serial criminals out there that the local police can't catch. There are other alleged victims' belongings, but the only thing we found by the river was your wife's. I don't know what to tell you honestly, and I can't get your hopes up either. I think we should wait. Of course, we'll keep looking. It's quite possible they'll give us something more. We can't rule out the possibility that your wife lost her purse and left her things on the beach, swam far away, and then changed clothes. If she had just lost the purse, she would probably have reported her passport missing, objected James, who realized that the investigator was trying hard to smooth things over. You just tell it like it is. Why be shy and make assumptions that have absolutely nothing to do with reality? We're all adults. What's the point of this circus? The investigator realized that James was right and fully shared his fears and assumptions. The man himself did not believe that the police would find Molly alive and well. If she had really lost her bag, she would have already started to recover her documents, and so there was really no hope. All this is empty talk about nothing, and as they say, in favor of the poor. James did not grieve for long as soon as the deadline passed. The man immediately began to deal with the procedure for recognizing his wife as deceased. This insisted Ann Kelly, who, like Velcro, clung to James and was not going to fall behind him. The man did not resist it so much. He was even seriously considering proposing marriage to his chosen one. What's the big deal, Mom? He reasoned when they broached the subject in conversation. Molly was no longer alive, at least not officially. Soon she would be. Yes, and if she were alive, she would definitely have shown up by now. Life and limb have been hurt, and you know it. And a nice, not bad woman. I'm not good. We have an apartment. Why don't we get together? Son, not forgetting that you have a child, reminded James Miranda, who sometimes really seemed to have forgotten about Lisa. Are you sure Honey can be a good stepmother to her? I don't know, James shrugged. She and I haven't discussed it. What does it matter? I have you. And you're kind of already calling the shots. If you take care of Lisa, she's not so little anymore. A few more years, and she'll be able to handle herself, even if Kelly doesn't accept her into our family. Can't you take care of your granddaughter? Miranda didn't like this way of putting it, but she didn't dare to argue with her son. The woman wished him only happiness and sincerely sympathized. James really had so much on his plate. Lately, Miranda could not even imagine how he was coping with it all. My poor boy, the woman lamented to herself as she thought of James. But that's okay. There would be light after the dark streaks. We just have to wait a little longer. Of course, Kelly had no intention of having James and Molly's daughter live with them. The woman didn't just want to settle down with James. She wanted to get a foothold with him. And to do that, Kelly needed her own child with him. Naturally, she didn't tell James openly about her plans. The woman wanted to surprise him. Until now, Kelly pretended to treat Lisa well. But it would be better if the girl stayed with her grandmother for a while. The woman had never had children, and she didn't know how to deal with them. What if something goes wrong? Or will Lisa take it badly? After all, she had lost her mother so suddenly and unexpectedly, Kelly reasoned, every time she and James talk about bringing her daughter back to Home Harbor. Miranda is a closer person to her than I am. Come on. There's no telling how Lisa will feel about me. Honey expected that when she got pregnant, James would forget he ever had a daughter from his first marriage. The woman figured all his attention would be focused on the baby-to-be. That's what always happens when the second youngest child is due. But the pregnancy never came, and Kelly was already desperate. More and more, often thinking that she will never be able to become a mother. But the moment came when the good news finally hit Kelly. And from that moment, the rhetoric of her communication with James has changed very much. If before the woman allowed herself only to ask him for something, now she began to demand more and more from him. If James tried to refuse her so-called insistence, Kelly would throw tantrums at him. It's like you don't care how we live our lives. Me and our future son, she said. When James had told Kelly that he didn't see the point of selling the apartment, the man had really thought it was too costly and useless. But think of what we can buy with the money, he reasoned. Do you want a better house? But if we take an apartment in a better house, it will be smaller. Otherwise, we won't have enough. And I have a daughter, by the way. And as you remember, you and I agreed that she would live with us. We have to get Lisa away from my mom. She can't live with her grandmother. She has a father. But Kelly wouldn't even hear of it. What daughter? James. She was outraged. What are you talking about? I'm expecting a baby, and I can't handle 2 kids at once. Your mom can handle Lisa just fine. And after all, she's not a little girl anymore, and she's doing quite well with Miranda. And you and I will soon have a baby of our own to take care of. Lisa was indeed doing very well under Miranda's wing. The woman had also grown attached to her granddaughter. She could hardly bear to have her around for days at a time, thinking that it took away from the time she could be spending on her own affairs. But after Molly's disappearance, everything changed. Miranda felt genuinely sorry for the girl who, in effect, had been abandoned to her fate. And the woman's case was getting smaller and smaller. She was getting older. Her strength was gradually leaving her, and spending quiet time at home in the company of her granddaughter was probably the best way for her to spend her days and evenings. Lisa did not want to join her father's new family. She was too young to understand and perceive such serious things, but she could already feel the betrayal. It was impossible to perceive James's deed in any other way. Even Miranda, who had always supported her son in everything and indulged him, condemned him in her heart. The woman could not understand how it was possible to abandon her daughter so easily and effortlessly, dump the girl on her grandmother, and devote herself entirely to building her new personal life. After the disappearance of her mother, Lisa lost not only Molly, but also her father, who favored another family. It would seem that what prevents raising 2 children? What is the problem at all? Dozens or even hundreds of families live like that. But Kelly didn't want to burden herself with someone else's child, or share her husband's love and attention with Lisa, but it wasn't just that. Material considerations were also important. James had an apartment, of course, inherited from his wife, who he convinced that he also has every right to the inheritance left by his mother. But the man had no money as such. No, James worked, of course. To allow himself to sit on Kelly's neck just as he had once parasitized the machine, he could not. But the man's earnings would hardly be enough to provide a decent life for her and her child and her eldest daughter. Lisa was clearly superfluous in her picture of the world, and Kelly had gotten rid of her very carefully. And absolutely no sense of guilt about it the woman did not feel. Especially after her son Jacob was born. James was overjoyed to have a son, which was something. It was not to say that he did not tea in the baby's soul and jumped up, barely heard his crying. But Jacob James was much more involved in raising Jacob than he was in raising Lisa. And it was hard to argue with that. Even Miranda noticed, as much as James had changed only his fickle mother, for the better concerned solely with his new family. It was as if he'd forgotten about his ex-wife altogether, and his daughter, pushing her farther and farther away from him, even though he continued to be her official father. "Son, do you at least give us some money once in a while?" said Miranda, when James once again came to her house for tea. "Everything is so expensive now, and my pension is not a rubber. I support Lisa as much as I can, of course, but it's her father's job to take part in her upbringing, at least financially." So ever since James had a son, money had been an issue. and Kelly's been pushing the man around, tightening the screws. We don't have enough for everything we want. She was indignant every time James delayed the mother's paychecks to support her daughter. And you're giving them money. Oh, so we'll go to the world. The woman herself, of course, did not work. She was on maternity leave. The question of selling the apartment to buy, albeit smaller, but better quality housing, was still very acute. Kelly insisted. James refused. But as a result, the woman still managed to convince the man that it was necessary. Miranda did not like the idea, but she could not dissuade her son from killing himself under the pressure of a new daughter-in-law, who liked the woman much less than the old one. And Miranda had no strength for that. Lately, she had begun to give up very badly. Every day, Miranda felt worse and could not understand what was happening to her. Naturally, the woman had no time to go to doctors and have herself examined. And where would she get it from? She was completely immersed in caring for her granddaughter. Daily chores took up all her time. She had no time to sit down, to take Lisa to school, to pick her up, to do her homework, to go for a walk. Miranda never let her granddaughter go anywhere alone. She was very afraid for her in so many ways. Like any other person of her age, the woman loved to watch the news, especially crime news, on the basis of which in her head informed a rather gruesome picture of the modern world with all its nuances and dangers. James did not interfere with his daughter's upbringing. He gave the reins of Lisa to his mother. He didn't care about her at all. Life had changed, and every day more and more depressed him. The man could hardly believe that once he could fall in love with this woman, and she was so light and airy that against her background, Molly seemed the most real bore and saw. Kelly was even worse, and in his thoughts, James found himself going back to the time when he'd been with Molly and realizing that he missed her very much. It wasn't surprising at all. It would have been strange if James had thought any differently. Living with Molly, he had not burdened himself with anything. His vigorous activity was limited to imaginary help to his wife, which was only from the outside. In fact, the man did nothing. But with Kelly, he had to pull the whole family. This relaxed lady, who once spent time with him without asking anything in return, there was no trace. With the arrival of her son, Kelly became the most real, squeamish, and capable of eating anyone's ear. Much less her own husband. But it went with her. James could no longer whatsoever, and they still had a family. And the man loved his little son and could not imagine his life without him. James could not even imagine that soon it will be even more difficult for him, as well as the fact that he would be faced with a very difficult and fateful choice. Against Miranda's advice, Molly, James, and Kelly sold the old apartment. As the woman dreamed, they moved into a much more comfortable living space, which, however, cost them a little more expensive than they had planned. The couple hoped that after the sale, there would be some money left that they could put aside. But no, James and Kelly spent every penny they could get from the sale of their old home to buy a new one. A few months after the move, Miranda fell ill. Ailments which the woman regularly faced turned out to be not an idle sound. Only then she did not attach much importance to them. And for nothing. If the woman had taken care of her health in time, instead of avoiding going to the doctor, justifying herself by endless business and worries, the current situation with her health could have been corrected. But as it was, she came to the examination too late when she felt bad. The diagnosis was disappointing. "Is there nothing that can be done?" asked James, who was gripped by such intense despair. He realized that if his mother was gone, his life would change dramatically, and it would affect everything, including his relationship with Kelly. And the fate of Lisa. James found it very difficult to accept the reality he faced. He couldn't imagine that one day she would be in such a horrible situation. "But you realize that now, you're going to have to take Lisa back to you and Kelly," Miranda said. "There's no other way out. I'm going to have a harder time looking after her every day." So, it's time to put your wife in her place. You can't raise one child and leave the other one to fend for herself. You realize, I hope you do, that this is not only wrong, but unacceptable. Of course, James understood, but it didn't make him feel any better. From time to time, the man had the feeling that he was trapped in a trap from which there was no escape, and he was floundering, but could not escape. Kelly. The news of Miranda's terminal illness was very upsetting. She realized that Lisa would now live with them, and had already regretted that she had persuaded her husband to buy a smaller apartment. She couldn't imagine how they'd all fit together in this meager square footage. How could Kelly have known it would be like this? The only hope was Miranda's apartment, which James would inherit. But even here, Kelly was in for a very unpleasant surprise. Then when the woman had given her apartment to Lisa while she was still alive and had registered it in the ownership of the girl as simply as a car, the apartment, which after the woman was recognized as deceased, inherited James. It was not possible to let Miranda's home go to waste, and that pissed off Kelly, who had long since opened her mouth wide to someone else's loaf. And you, as her son, she left you nothing? Kelly resented Taras. Is there any way to dispute it or do something about it? No, I don't understand. Jacob is as much Miranda's grandson as Lisa. But for some reason, she wrote her everything and didn't leave our boy a dime. Don't you think that's unfair? Personally, I think it's just out of line. Kelly resented the situation to the core, and every chance she got, she'd play the same song. God, James was tired of it all. It would have been better if he hadn't contacted her at all. It would have been cheaper. Daughter and stepmother are nice. And she didn't even try to build a relationship. Lisa insanely insulted the great-grandmother. With Miranda's death, the last person close to her disappeared. She didn't consider the father who betrayed her to be her father. Yes, Lisa was forced to live with him and his wife under the same roof because she was a minor and had no other choice. But this did not affect her attitude towards her father. She was very much offended by him and could not forgive James, and did not want to. Kelly constantly only did that under the night her husband to throw her daughter somewhere. The woman didn't calm down for a second. Lisa's presence was very much in her way. To say the least, it was interfering with her plans. Miranda's apartment, which the woman had counted on so much, could not be sold, and she would never get a piece of it. Kelly held her stepdaughter responsible for all her troubles, and slept to get rid of her. Why don't you send Lisa to boarding school? She suggested to James. We'll take her away at weekends. Why don't we? Why not? What do you think? Why should I send my daughter to boarding school? James was surprised. Lisa is just as much a part of my family as you are, Jacob. And you'll have to accept that and build a relationship with her somehow. There's no other way. Unable to get rid of her stepdaughter, Kelly tried her best to use her for her own purposes. The woman persuaded Lisa to help her with the baby, trying to gently instill in the girl that it is her sacred duty. But Lisa was more interested in her studies. She wasn't going to mess around with other people's cookies and cradles. And, to tell the truth, the girl did not perceive Jacob as her brother because of resentment to her father. If she was older, she would like to live alone in her grandmother's apartment, where she would be her own mistress. But unfortunately, Lisa was too young for that, and only a miracle could get her out of the underworld in which she was forced to exist. And it did happen, even though Lisa wasn't expecting it. That day, when Molly returned home after what she had been through, she expected to be met on the threshold of the apartment by her loving husband who had suffered for her all these years. The woman could barely make it to her home. To say the least, she could hardly remember who she was or where she lived to survive the horror that had suddenly descended on her like a snowball. She found the strength to move on, not for herself, but for her family. First and foremost, for her daughter. The love that had always been in her heart, even when Molly was in complete unconsciousness. The woman could not have expected that instead of her husband and daughter, she would meet a neighbor in the stairwell who would tell her that James had not been waiting for her for a long time. He got married. And not only did he start a new family, but he also sold the apartment, the family property that Molly inherited from her late mom. "Cholera," Molly exclaimed after hearing Nancy. "Where's my daughter? What about her?" "Miranda. She died too," sighed the woman and continued her story, which shocked Molly more and more. "What am I going to do now?" the woman exclaimed, sitting down on the stairwell. "How could he do such a thing? How could he have the conscience to do it?" "Well, you're not exaggerating it either," said the neighbor, who, as best she could, tried to calm Molly. "You disappeared first. He was looking for you. He went to the police. He did everything he could. He went to the police and did all kinds of things. And then the coroner said they found your things in another town by the river. What was he supposed to do? He was signing up to be a nun too. I'm sorry, you'll take your daughter away from him and get on with your life. You haven't told me what happened to you? You've been away for so many years. Where have you been all this time? What happened to Molly was so horrible, it's scary to say. Unfortunately, she didn't remember the smallest details, like so many other difficult and painful episodes in her life. Otherwise, she'd just go crazy. Molly, as she had planned, went to Cindy's house. She was really looking forward to visiting her. Her grandmother and mother's relationship had left a lot to be desired all her life. Cindy could not forgive her daughter for leaving for the big city. The woman felt that her daughter had abandoned her. And although Molly's mother repeatedly offered her to move, Cindy refused. The village was her native home, but she didn't know what to expect from city life. As the years passed, the relationship between mother and daughter never changed. Of course, from time to time, her mother sent Molly to her grandmother in the village. It became especially urgent after the divorce. The woman had to work hard to provide her daughter with a decent life. And any vacation was out of the question. And the constant presence of her daughter made her tired too, to tell the truth. Molly loved spending time in the countryside. Fresh air, a river, freedom. What could be better? When she was a teenager, she enjoyed socializing with local kids who also came to grandparents on vacation. Among them was a local kid who spent his whole conscious life in the village with his grandfather. He had his eye on Molly or someone else. Then she was too young for such relationships, so Correct politely refused the young man, which gave birth to him even more complexes, which later affected not only his own life, but also the fate of those whom he perceived as his abusers and other innocent people. The boy was really unlucky in life. Charles was funny and unattractive, was born under different circumstances. He could have directed all his energies to study, to enter an institute, to take, as it is said, his place under the sun. But he was born into a very poor and marginalized family. The boy's parents drank terribly and left life very early. The heart of a man and a woman could not stand the constant drinking, and Charles stayed with his grandfather, the only adequate and sane relative who tried his best to bring up the boy decently, and he swears, and he was no good in life. It cannot be said that their deaths affected the lives of Charles and his grandfather very much. After themselves, they left nothing good to the boy, except hereditary health problems and, in fact,
The heredity itself, which gradually began to declare itself louder and louder. Every year, Charles became more and more angry. He hated life, which, as he believed, was extremely unfair to him. Anger at fate. But who and where
he was born worsened his peers for the fact that they always rejected him. Up to a time, the young man hid his emotions. He knew he had to behave well. At least he didn't want to upset his grandfather, Charles. Only when the old man who had devoted his whole life to his grandson passed away and Charles was left all alone Could he allow himself to be who he really was? After the death of his grandfather, the then very young man had nothing left but the old house. Significant savings, which would be enough for his grandson at least for the first time. Grandpa was never able to do so. The meager income he received from the local farm and the small pension were barely enough to make ends meet. The man tried to put something away, but it didn't always work. There was an envelope in the trunk that Charles had been pointed to by his grandfather before he died. The young man took it out immediately after his grandfather's death. He had to pay for the funeral. That's all he had enough for. And there was still some money left to live on for a while. Then he had to decide what to do. Charles could not survive on his own unless he went begging in the neighborhood, which was not only completely unacceptable, but also pointless. All the people in the neighborhood were as poor as he and his grandfather, so hardly anyone would help an adult. By the standards of the village, there was a man to plow on. Charles had no choice but to sell his grandfather's house. Fortunately, the old man signed it over to his grandson while he was still alive, so that the young man didn't have to run through the authorities, spend time and money on inheritance registration. If grandfather had known then what a fatal mistake he was making, he would never have done that. He had hoped that Charles would keep the family home, but he decided to throw it away, plowing the local farm for a young man completely indecent. In fact, like all the other prospects that village life offered him. He hoped that the proceeds from the sale of the house would be enough at least for a move to the city and a modest life for a few months. And so it was. The village where Charles and his grandfather lived was abandoned, but there was still a demand for the house among the inhabitants of the neighboring village, which was in an even more decadent state. Those wishing to buy found immediately, as soon as rumors of Charles's sale spread through the village. It didn't even take any effort to find a buyer. A mother and son from a neighboring village were happy to move in the same day they arrived for the viewing. "You can't imagine how happy it is!" the woman exclaimed enthusiastically. "And you certainly do not think of it. You have at least a school here, and we have nothing at all. My son has been taken to school every morning by bus to Zlaris every year." Charles was shocked. It turns out that for some, it's happiness to live in such squalor and not even think about something more. "Of course, I haven't changed my mind," he said firmly. "We can make the deal right the other day. The main thing is that the woman should give all her savings for the house as soon as possible." It wasn't a very large sum, but Charles had enough to move to town and rent a room, get a job, and live for a few months with very little to spare. Having received a considerable amount of money, by the standards of his life, the young man bought himself everything he had never had before, and dressed himself in the latest fashion, and even acquired an expensive smartphone. But money has a tendency to run out, and the job Charles took did not bring the income that would allow, in his opinion, to live a decent life. He was not enough money. The prospects that the city life opened before him everything. He had even found a girlfriend. But still, everything was not the same, and not the same. A young man with such complexes became a good target for scumbags, with whom Charles met quite by accident in his own entrance. The local gang needed a six for a long time, and Charles was the best fit for this role. The men quickly took him in, and he himself was glad. They gave him money, which Charles had enough not for a rented room, but for a whole apartment. And life became much more interesting and cheerful. It was this so-called fraternity that had a very strong influence on Charles. Having got in touch with them, he realized that it is impossible to earn a lot of money honestly and provide a decent life. It's a completely different thing to help these people. That's what you get paid for. a lot and the time spent is justified. Why waste your life on something that will not bring proper and necessary fruits, when it can be spent on something useful? This principle became a defining principle for Charles. Gradually, he turned from a battered and oppressed village boy into a brash, insolent man. Eventually, he got tired of being hysterical, and Charles decided he needed a change. He wanted to sail free. However, to gain authority turned out to be a very difficult and risky business. But Charles still achieved his goal by the time he accidentally met Molly, his first love, who had rejected him because of her young age. Charles was already a wealthy businessman, and in a sense he was running the whole town. But could she have even guessed that fate was preparing her for such a cruel and unfair ordeal? Of course not. Molly hadn't been to those parts for a long time. And how long had it been? She had long ago and did not remember that very village Charlesque, who laid out for her like a dog. But he remembered her, and remembered her so well, that when he saw her, he felt uncomfortable. His eyes began to bleed, his hands shook, his back went slack. When Charles came to his senses to approach Molly, to talk to her, he realized that the shirt he wore under his jacket could have been pressed off, so sweaty with excitement and anger. And she didn't even recognize him right away. That's how it is, Charles thought to himself. You love someone. Love a person? Suffer for him, eh? Carefully keeps the memories of him in your mind for many years, and he has long forgotten you. And many years later won't even recognize you when you meet him by chance on the street. Unfairly, however unfairly. I'm Charles, the man said, seeing Molly's questioning look, when he approached and said hello to her. Charles, from the village. Don't you remember? You came to visit your grandmother when you were just a girl. And I'm a local. You turned me down because you were too young. Molly immediately disliked the tone in which Charles spoke to her. No matter how hard he tried to restrain himself, he wasn't very good at it. She immediately sensed something wrong and wanted to leave. But the man grabbed her arm and stopped her from doing so. Come with me, he commanded. Will you come with me? It won't take long. I haven't taken much time from you. Come on, come on! We need to talk. Huh. Don't be afraid. It'll be okay. Oh, Molly tried not only to break free, but also to scream. She hoped that being in such a crowded place as a public park, she could count on the help of passers-by to help her escape from this inadequate and unhinged man. But no. People paid attention to what was happening and looked at the strange couple with a sidelong glance. No one dared to come up and stand up for the poor woman. When one brave volunteer was found, Charles immediately cooled his ardor, finding an explanation for his monstrous behavior. Yes, I had a fight with my wife, he grinned. That's all right, we'll take care of it. Go where you were going. A mumbled passerby who was ready to snatch Molly from Charles's hands. Slapped the man a couple of times. I'm sorry then. It's a family matter, of course. But I didn't know at that moment, when the failed savior went on with his business, paying absolutely no attention to the screams and resistance of the poor woman, Molly had lost the last hope for salvation. A moment later, Charles put her in a car and drove her somewhere. The man shoved a stinking rag under her nose, and Molly lost consciousness. She woke up in some abandoned forest and realized with horrors that she did not remember anything. Neither what her name was, nor how she was here. At that moment, the poor woman was gripped by a fear that she had never experienced before in her life. Subconsciously, Molly felt that something very terrible had happened to her, but she couldn't remember what it was. She wandered and wandered through the woods until she came upon some small village. Despair. The woman knocked on the first door she could find. What the hell is this? Exclaimed a woman in her 70s. Where did you come from? Did you get lost? I mumbled confusedly to Molly, who did not even know how to properly explain what had happened to her, so that the slightest woman wouldn't think anything bad of her. At that moment, Molly needed help so badly that she just couldn't let her grandmother chase her away. Stammering and struggling to find the right words, the woman mumbled something completely unrelated and inarticulate. Her head was hurting badly, her eyes were swimming, and at a certain point, Molly felt the ground slipping away from under her feet. She almost fainted right there on the doorstep of the little house. Luckily, her grandmother was understanding and took Molly by the hand and led her into one of the rooms where she could barely walk on her own feet. "You should lie down to rest, my dear," said the grandmother. "We'll sort out the rest later. Now I'll feed you broth, give you tea, and you sleep. And then you and I will decide what to do next." Molly didn't remember falling asleep. She did not even notice how she was ruined. The woman woke up only a few hours later. She was in the same cabin, which calmed her down a bit. "So nothing terrible has happened to me anymore," she thought to herself. "Thank God, I just can't take any more shocks." After listening to Molly, the grandmother only sighed and said only one thing about her story: you should go to the police, and it would not hurt to go to the hospital too. "I can't help you, unfortunately. Apparently, you're in a lot of trouble, huh? They did this to you. And I'm an old man. I don't need your problems. So you're going to kick me out?" puzzled asked Molly, who could not believe that not so long ago, grandmother was so kind, responsive, and ready to help her. "And where will I go?" "Here in the neighborhood. Solid forest belt." "I don't know the area. I don't remember anything, you know? What am I going to do?" "But I won't kick you out now," the old woman promised. "You'll survive a few days of rest. You'll come to your senses. Maybe you'll remember something. And then I'll take you to the police and the hospital. That's their job, to deal with people like you." "Well, what did you think? You can't stay here with me for any length of time. You need to find out who you are, what you are. What if your family's waiting for you at home and you're here?" "It's cool. Come on. Come on, sweetheart. Rest, come to your senses, and in a few days we'll go to the police with you. They would figure it out." Molly hoped she could talk the old woman out of it. After all, this old woman who had given her shelter was her only hope for salvation, but the grandmother was adamant. A few days later, when she saw that Molly had come to her senses, she went back to talking about going to the police and the hospital. Molly tried to pretend to feel ill, but the old woman immediately snapped her out of it, ending the simulation. "Strictly," she said, "I have lived many years in the world and certainly know how to distinguish a seriously ill person from a healthy one." Going to the police was fatal for Molly. Naturally, Charles had extensive connections in the city and everywhere else he could and couldn't. And no sooner had Molly crossed the threshold of the department and asked the duty officer for help, as it immediately became known to her tormentor. It is possible that if the woman still managed to get to the investigator, he would have helped her. Even, most likely, he would have helped her. The man had worked for many years to strictly and rigorously observe the law and took no part in any nefarious criminal endeavors. But not all employees were like that. And on that day, the very man who was well acquainted with Charles was on duty. He knew right away that what had happened to Molly was no accident. Their town was small, and such crimes with such an outcome were very rare. The man realized that Molly did not look like a victim of local nicknames. Otherwise, she simply would not have come to the police. The woman would not have been alive long ago, which means that this is an internal squabble of local criminals. Of course, the duty officer assumed that he might be wrong, but he decided to be on the safe side and call Charles. He jumped up as soon as he heard his voice in the receiver, not letting it go anywhere. He bellowed, "I'll be right there!" "Unfortunately, the investigator won't be able to see you today," the duty officer lied, trying to get Molly out of the department as quickly as possible. "It's an emergency. You know, things happen." Criminals don't sleep. We don't have to. But how? Molly asked in confusion. What am I supposed to do now? You go to the hospital, smiled the duty officer. It's not far away, 2 streets away. I'll show you the way. Maybe they will help you remember something, and tomorrow you'll come to us. I will. Molly had no choice but to agree. And as soon as she left the office and walked to the next street, Charles immediately dragged her into the car. Wow, the ancestor of the forefathers, he muttered. You must have gotten from the woods to the city? And to snitch on me, I thought, but I'll make it up to you. Molly did not understand what was happening. The last time the man had hit her so hard on the head that she'd actually lost her memory. She didn't recognize Charles, and she didn't know what he wanted from her. And he miscalculated, so you don't remember anything yet. That was a good one last time. That was great. I'm so good. But it's better I'll make a normal man for myself. You'll serve me till you're old. Molly didn't know what was happening. Her eyes went black again. She woke up in an abandoned cellar. It was well equipped and looked like a small apartment. But the woman immediately guessed that she was underground. The room was so cold that there was absolutely no doubt about it. Molly tried to jerk the door, but it was firmly locked. To get out of this place, into which she had fallen against her will, was unrealistic. And the realization of that horror was what frightened the woman. Charles appeared a few minutes later, and not alone, but accompanied by a guard, whom he asked to wait outside the door. The man looked victorious. He had the kind of look that made Molly uncomfortable when he threw it on them. Well, he asked with a squint, you slept well, rested? Now we can talk. He went on and on about his first love, and for a whole hour he shared with Molly his crazy adolescent fantasies that made the poor woman shiver. She apologized to him if she had ever offended him, begged him to let her go, and said she couldn't remember anything. But Charles was completely indifferent to the poor woman's lamentations. If you behave well, we'll move to a big house, he promised. You'll have everything there, absolutely everything. I'll throw everything at your feet in gold. But for that, I must be sure you won't pull any tricks. I have to trust you, you know? And you have to trust me. You and me, we're going to have a nice, close-knit family. You're going to give me lots of kids. I'm sure we'll make it. We're so young, aren't we? These words made Molly turn everything upside down and inside. The situation she found herself in was so monstrous that it was impossible to describe in words. But as much as she wanted to, she had to resign herself to it and even pretend that she agreed to his terms. What else could she do? Even though Molly didn't remember Charles at all, she realized that she was dealing with an abnormal person, with a sick imagination. He was completely devoid of compassion. Nothing and no one exists for him except his own horrible plans and goals. And Charles will realize them at any cost, will stop at nothing. Molly begins to behave as he expects her to behave. The poor woman had no other choice. It was the only thing that could save her. And Molly understood that. But such disgust, as after the night spent with him together, the woman has never felt before. She realized what kind of man he was. And it was a good thing Molly didn't remember what Charles had done to her the first time he'd kidnapped her. She simply couldn't remember it since she was unconscious. If she remembered, she wouldn't be able to play along. Life seemed unbearable. Every day, Charles realized the fruits of his sick imagination, and Molly was forced to endure it. And so it went on for several years, until the woman's memory returned. It happened suddenly. As if at the snap of fingers in Molly's head, all the events of her former life were restored. She remembered who she was, where she came from, that she had a husband and a daughter, and was horrified. Oh my God, she thought to herself. What am I going to do now? Fortunately, Charles was not around when Molly had her sudden epiphany. If he had realized that her memory had returned, he would have locked her up. But Molly had a chance to escape. A very small one, of course, but a chance nonetheless. She had to think of a plan to accomplish what she had planned. It had to be perfect. Molly couldn't settle. She had to get home safe and sound for her daughter's sake. The poor woman's heart was breaking as she thought of her daughter. How was she there? What was wrong with her? Molly hoped her daughter was being taken care of. James Miranda, too, had to be intimately involved in Lisa's life, for her husband had taken her to her for a week. Did he take her back? And how were they doing now? The thoughts in Molly's head swirled one after another. The woman tried hard to chase them away. What she needed to think about now was not about that, but about escape. About how to do everything to stay alive. Otherwise, none of this made absolutely no sense. When Molly had managed to escape, she couldn't believe she had done it. How she had only had the courage to do it. An enraged Charles could have just as easily killed her, or worse, locked her up again and forced her to fulfill his monstrous desires. But, fortunately, everything turned out all right. And it didn't happen. The day the woman managed to leave her tormentor's lair for good, which Charles considered a large and cozy home, they drove into town. The man had relaxed a great deal lately. He hadn't realized that his so-called wife, who had been living undocumented for several years, had regained her memory. The man trusted her. Charles wanted very much to believe that Molly really loved him, sincerely and truly. On the way out, she asked him to buy a bottle of water. "It's so hot," the woman wailed. "I'm thirsty." "But there are no stores here," Charles said at a loss. "You should have brought water with you. I should have thought of that. Forgive me, you fool." "It's all right," Molly said. "There's a stand over there. Maybe we'll drive over there and have a look." Charles sped off at full speed. Usually they were accompanied by a driver and a guard. But that day the man wanted to go for a ride and sit in a nice restaurant alone with his wife. Mindful of his pernicious heredity, which played a fatal and defining role in his life, the man was not attracted to alcohol, so he could afford to go to the restaurant by car. At least there was something good about him, if you could call it that. And in general, if it were not for his complexes and the desire to avenge his past failure to everyone and everything, Charles could have had quite a prosperous, happy life. But no, he chose his fate. And if for criminal deeds, Charles never once, as they say, didn't nail the tail, then for the kidnapping, holding Molly, he got the full program. As soon as he got out of the car and headed for the store, Molly carefully opened the door. "Wow," she thought to herself. "He didn't even lock the doors. Well, that's good for me." The man glanced at the car through the glass door of the store, but turned away when he saw the small counter with flowers, and Molly seized the moment. She saw that the man had switched his attention from the car to the flowers and, jumping at 6, she jumped out of the car and ran into the woods. Molly didn't remember exactly how long she ran for. Maybe 20 minutes, maybe half an hour, maybe longer. The woman came to her senses only when she found herself on the road on the opposite side of the forest. There was a car parked there, and a man ran out of the bushes, who, noticing Molly, immediately rushed to the car. "I beg you," she exclaimed, "let me down. I beg you, if you tell me, I'll be killed." The man stared at her, eyes wide. Of course, and he had encountered various surprises on the road before this moment. But this, something like this. "What happened to you?" he asked. "Can you explain to me what happened next?" "Everything then," Molly begged. "Come on, get in the car quickly. Let's go. I'm asking you very much." The man himself did not expect to be so penetrated by this complete stranger. He never imagined he'd ever find himself in a situation like this, and Mason had certainly never agreed to give anyone a ride before. You never know. When he'd found out where Molly needed a ride, he'd been nearly speechless. The woman decided she had nothing to lose. It couldn't get any worse, so she told him her whole story from beginning to end. Mason was horrified. He never thought that in the modern world, such a thing was possible. What kind of a monster is this? He was outraged. He belonged in prison, not among normal people. The planned trip to the cottage had to be canceled. Mason couldn't leave Molly behind, and it was too risky to transfer her to another vehicle. How grateful she was that he had agreed to drive her to the city. It was a long drive, almost 24 hours, but he'd agreed anyway. A complete stranger had given her a helping hand when she had no hope at all. "I'll be here for a few more days," Mason said. "And after dropping Molly off at the driveway, I'll stay at a hotel. If you need any help, feel free to call. I have a phone number to write down." Molly had nothing, no money, no ID, nothing at all, just what she was wearing. Realizing that he had done something stupid, Vyacheslav apologized. "And no big deal," grinned Molly. "I'll remember it that way," dictates. How foolish it was to hope that James would welcome her with open arms. It wasn't until Molly learned about everything that had happened while she was away that she realized how much of a mistake it had been to commit her life to this man. She rushed to Miranda's apartment. The neighbor didn't know James's new place of residence. But the woman didn't have a key to her mother-in-law's apartment either. "Shit! What to do?" she exclaimed, and realized that it remains only to wait and hope that the now ex-husband or his new wife will appear here. And it was to wait for an unknown amount of time. Fortunately, the day of Molly's sudden appearance and the day James decided to clean up his late mother's old apartment coincided. From time to time, he visited Miranda's place to keep it clean. The man did not dare to rent the apartment, although the sweetheart insisted on it. The family needed extra money, but James did not want to let his mother and strangers into the apartment. That day he had just come to clean up, and when he saw Molly sitting in the stairwell, propping her head up with her hands, he was almost speechless. "It's you," he muttered confusedly, staring absently at the woman. "It's definitely you. It just can't be. How did you end up here, huh? Where have you been all these years?" "I almost went crazy. I'm our daughter." James couldn't believe that Molly was standing in front of him, his wife, who he had lost years ago and now, miraculously, had found. It didn't seem real. And it seemed to Molly that the man was asking too many questions for the man who had betrayed her. Of course, Molly did not forgive him, although James tried to make it happen. But the woman was adamant, and what was against it was not that her husband had found another woman. After all, she had been gone for so many years. James believed she was dead and had buried her for himself. He had every right to build his own personal life. What was most repulsive to Molly was the way she and Kelly treated her daughter. After Molly's disappearance, Lisa was no longer needed by her father. For that, she could never forgive James, much less take him back. Such behavior in Molly's perception was beyond good and evil. James had shown his true colors in a difficult life situation, and she didn't need any more proof of his meanness. As soon as the woman restored all the documents and returned to normal life, she immediately took her daughter to herself. Together with Lisa, they moved into Miranda's apartment, which the woman had so thoughtfully left as an inheritance to her granddaughter. Molly had not expected such an act from her mother-in-law, and she was pleasantly surprised by it. James had no choice but to stay with Kelly. She kept nagging him, and he lived with her for his son. Years went by that he could have spent happily if he hadn't been so weak and mean. But that was his choice. The man couldn't change his life. James just didn't have the strength for it. Molly found her happiness next to Mason, who turned out to be a very successful businessman. He never left town until he was sure that everything was all right with the woman, and then they called and texted frequently. He was a lonely widower who often spent time at the dacha, where he immersed himself in memories of the happy years spent with his beloved wife. The man didn't think he could ever love anyone else, but he was wrong. He loved Molly with all his heart and soul. He supported her always and in everything and everywhere, including at Charles's trial where Molly testified. She was so afraid that he would get away with it. But fortunately, those fears were completely in vain. Charles was sent to prison for a very long time. In addition to kidnapping Molly, Charles was convicted of other cases. In his last statement, he said he was remorseful and sorry for what happened. But that's life. And if he'd had the chance, he would have lived it differently. But he was deprived of such a chance from birth. That's why he became what he is. And it is unlikely that the fate of another person in his place could have turned out differently. At least, he was personally convinced of that. And it was unlikely that anyone or anything could have influenced him and convinced him otherwise.